Hey everyone, we're about to get a little controversial here. Now, just in case you're wondering, the thumbnail is sort of a joke, it's clickbait. My revenue isn't great here, but I'm not going to become one of those anti-woke grifters, the guys who look at every new movie or video game and they're like, oh, this is woke. They made the main character a woman and her tits aren't big enough. It's woke, it's woke. The West has fallen. But the subject is sort of related in a very abstract way, and you'll get what I mean later. So first of all, one thing that I'll never do on this channel is I'm not going to do react videos. I consider it a waste of my time. I know there's some people who say, oh, check out what this guy's writing or check out what this guy is saying in a video. Would you respond to it? And most of the time, no. I don't respond to bullshit. It is a waste of everyone's time. The best thing you can do is just kind of dismiss it. So I'm going to reference a video I saw that kind of inspired this video I'm making now, but I'm not going to link to it. I'm not going to give any channel name or anything like that. It's not to deprive them of views. I don't want any drama with people going over there and flooding the comments or something like that. There's also a second kind of similar video that had similar content, and the fact that I saw two videos on this very similar topic is kind of the reason why I'm making this video, because I have to say something about this phenomenon, basically. But let's just get right into it. So I got a recommendation for a video, and it was about myths in the famous movie Enemy at the Gates. Some of you might remember a 2001 movie, Enemy at the Gates, starring Jude Law, Rachel Weisz, and Ed Harris. It is about the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, the title Enemy at the Gates is actually a book by William Craig, which is about Stalingrad. It is not particularly accurate today. It was written a long time ago, before historians had very good access to Soviet archives and stuff like that. So the problem is that it's sort of like pop history. I will say, if someone knew almost nothing about the Battle of Stalingrad, it's certainly worth a read. It's kind of a good intro to the topic. But there's a lot of research that happened long after that book came out, which sort of debunked some of the claims in there, but also added a lot of context, and we know a lot more about the battle than we did back then. So in that way, it's a little bit like Anthony Beevor's Stalingrad, basically pop history, but not something so dense like David M. Glantz's Stalingrad trilogy. If you want to see what I mean, just look those books up on Amazon. Anyway, though, here's the funny secret. So the film Enemy at the Gates is actually not based on the William Craig book. It is based on a novel called War of the Rats, and that kind of explains a lot of the historical inaccuracies in the basic story. Now, one funny thing about Enemy at the Gates that I notice while living in Russia is that Russians are often complaining about how Hollywood doesn't make World War II films about the Eastern Front. They don't make World War II films about the Red Army and what happened on the Eastern Front. And then, of course, this was a case where technically Hollywood, in reality, the director was French, I believe, and also the production company was British. The only Hollywood connection, I think, is Paramount was a distributor or something like that. But let's call it a Hollywood film. They make a big, I would say pretty successful Hollywood film about the Battle of Stalingrad. And, of course, the Russians don't like it. Now, this is not entirely unjustified, because I will tell you, as someone who's actually been to Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd, since 1961, this film is rife with all kinds of inaccuracies. I could make a massively long video about every little thing they get wrong in this film. Even the basic plot, the so-called sniper duel between Vasily Zaitsev and the German sniper, supposedly the head of the sniper school for the Wehrmacht. His name has been given as two different names. That whole thing basically didn't happen. Zaitsev was a very accomplished sniper. He's actually nowhere near the top scoring snipers in the Red Army for the war. If you look up Ivan Sidorenko, for example, he had far more kills than Vasily Zaitsev. Another interesting thing, though, is you can actually find an English translation of Vasily Zaitsev's memoirs. If I remember correctly, they were called Notes of a Russian Sniper or something to that effect. And what's interesting is that he doesn't really emphasize sniping a lot in the book. He even talks about a case where he was in close combat and basically choked a German out. So it wasn't all just cat and mouse and sniping. Stalingrad was a very intense battle where the combat was often room by room. But there are tons of other little errors in this film, and some of them are quite amusing. Like, the film begins showing a map, and it's showing how the Nazis were spreading and conquering all of Europe at the time. And like, someone noticed that if you look at the borders of Yugoslavia, they were basically like the borders of Yugoslavia that existed at the time they were making this film, around like 2000 or something like that. And of course, in the Second World War, Yugoslavia was one big country. It was actually the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Another funny error is there's a scene where you hear the Soviet national anthem playing, da, 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 da. The problem is that that was not the Soviet national anthem in 1942 when this film is taking place. That didn't become the national anthem officially until 1944. And I could just literally go on and on with all the inaccuracies in this film. But in this particular video, I got about a minute into it. And very quickly, I could see what the issue is. So, in the film, there is a lot of depiction of the Red Army killing its own men. And this is connected with something called Order 227 that was issued by Joseph Stalin in 1942. I'm not going to go into what that whole order entailed, because it's actually quite long and entailed various different measures. But the salient point of it that everybody brings up and often distorts is that this is the order that created the so-called blocking units. And these were units set up behind certain frontline Red Army units. Keep in mind, the Red Army is retreating at this time because the Germans were launching Operation Blau, where they were pushing in the south, trying to get into the Caucasus. That's what brought them towards Stalingrad. But basically, the blocking units, as everyone believes, and this film kind of would make you believe, is that if a Red Army unit retreated, they would be shot by their own men. And in the movie, this is depicted in the beginning, where we see the Red Army launch an assault on the German lines in Stalingrad, and only 1 out of 2 men has a rifle. There were a lot of problems with that claim right there. A few years ago, I did a video about the original Call of Duty series. Call of Duty pretty much ripped off Enemy at the Gates in most of the depiction of the Red Army. In the original game, in Call of Duty 2, even Call of Duty World at War, they're always just picking stuff from Enemy at the Gates. And in this scene, basically, the officers blow the whistle to attack, and the Red Army guys start streaming across the square, all shouting, "Ura!" And the Germans open fire, and the guys are getting cut down left and right. And eventually, a few guys who have survived are like, this is useless, it's hopeless, and they try to retreat back to the line where they started, and that's when these evil commissars, who have a Maxim machine gun next to them, they order to open fire, and they basically cut down all the guys who survived, and that was supposed to be Order 227, not a step back in action. It didn't really work that way. The way that was supposed to work was it was designed to stop panicked retreating, unauthorized retreating, which at the time had been kind of a problem. I'm not justifying, I'm just saying what actually happened. And you can find memoirs of Red Army soldiers who sometimes ran into blocking units. In one case, the guy just said, "We ran out of ammo. Like, what do you want us to do?" And they were like, "Okay, go on." Now, by that same token, knowing what I know about Russia today, could there have been plenty of situations where guys retreated for a very good reason and the blocking units decided that wasn't good enough and mowed them down? Very likely that also happened as well. After all the guys who got shot down by a blocking unit didn't survive to write memoirs. So this is brought up in this video I was watching, and then shortly after that, there was a statement by some German official. I'm talking about a modern, recent German official, referring to Russia and the fact that life is cheap there, doesn't hold the same value, and there was a strong implication that she was being sort of racist. And then this was followed by some clips from a very good documentary about the Vietnam War that is called Hearts and Minds. And there was a scene, if I remember correctly, it was with General Westmoreland when he was talking about the Vietnamese, and he said, rather callously, he said, life is cheap here, it doesn't hold the same value. And in that documentary, those scenes where he said that were cut. with footage from a funeral for a South Vietnamese soldier. And it shows the family mourning and crying. And it sort of juxtaposed this, like I said, callous claim of Westmoreland with the reality of what the Vietnamese people on both sides were going through. And when I saw this person's obviously going to try to argue against this idea that Russia doesn't value human life as much, I started to strongly suspect this person does not really have much direct knowledge of Russia. And also the implication that this was somehow racist or chauvinist or orientalist was very evident, and this is something that I noticed in the other video that sort of inspired this. And so I think it's time to talk about basically both these subjects, and about the issue of Orientalism and racism and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, today, the internet is awash in pretty much open racism. It's actually quite depressing. And one thing that I'll see oftentimes is when people are talking about Russia, they will often bring up this whole, they're not European, they're Asiatic, they're Mongol horde and stuff like that. And this is a genuinely racist argument, but I have always hated this for a number of reasons. And it's not simply because it's racist. Like, I will explain in concrete terms why this idea is stupid. It is true that what we call Russia today, which started out as Muscovy, their rise to power was connected to the Mongols, but that was more of a political thing. The Mongols didn't really colonize those territories. They didn't settle there. They just basically demanded tribute. The claim that Russian authoritarianism, whether in the form of Tsarist absolutism or Leninist communism or post-Soviet authoritarianism of Yeltsin and Putin, that this descends somehow from Mongol rule just doesn't really hold up to examination. The best argument is that a number of other modern states that were once under Mongol rule around the same time ended up becoming democracies. Some of them are democracies today. Some of these states had democratic movements. In some cases, they were crushed by the Russian Bolsheviks. And I'm talking about states that were basically successors of the successors to the Golden Horde. And finally, there is one modern democracy, a flawed democracy, but still a democracy, that also had a huge Mongol dominance and presence. You might have heard of it. It's called Mongolia. So, guys, I don't think it's the genetics, okay? That doesn't explain it. Now, what does explain it would be a very complicated topic to discuss. I'm not going to get into it too deeply. I would argue that it has to do with the expanse of Muscovy and later Russia's territory, the need to exert strong control and try to centralize, or that sort of striving to centralize because you have all this vast territory and you're controlling people who you have colonized who are very different from you. And also, in contrast to something like the British Empire, this was an empire where an uprising big enough means that they could just come and kick your ass, like something that, for example, the natives in America could not do to the British in Britain, right? They couldn't get in a fleet and sail over there and get revenge, whereas as the Muscovite state was rising and everything, there were big powers or potential rivals in the area that could potentially defeat them. And then after all that Tsarism, that idea that Russia needs a strong hand to keep it together because otherwise it'll be chaos, that idea just simply continued, often with different justifications. But that makes a lot more sense than this Mongol rule, or especially the Mongol genetic nonsense. But the other reason I really hate that argument, especially the idea that it's some kind of genetic thing, is that basically you take away agency from the Russians for what they do. And one thing you have to understand is that many of the people who believe that the Russians act the way they do because of some genetic flaw or some sort of Asiatic heritage, those people don't necessarily oppose Russia. Many of those people actually would like to do business with Russia, and what they hate is people like Ukrainians who they don't really see as different or better in any way. They hate that Ukrainians are getting in the way of all that wonderful profit by being invaded and not wanting to die. So to sum up that point, what I hate about that is just basically removing the agency, because the fact is that Russia has gone through several revolutions. They've gone through, in less than 100 years, they went through 2 total collapses of society and its replacement by something theoretically new and very different, but they keep falling into these habits. All the while, however, they have been exposed to outside ideas, and they could certainly have gone a different route if they really wanted to. And so when you act like they do this because of some innate genetic quality, what you're doing is you're really kind of removing the responsibility for what they've done or haven't done. You've removed the agency. And then you're just doing like what Noam Chomsky did a few years ago, just kind of reduce them to a sort of force of nature. And then it's like, well, what are you going to do? That's just what the Russians do. They're just going to invade countries and bomb cities and pillage. And a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, well, maybe if we just feed them a bigger part of Ukraine, they'll get bored or whatever. Maybe like Russia could have just a little genocide, just as a treat. But getting back to the topic at hand, I see a lot of naive and often well-meaning Westerners see some of that rhetoric, especially when it's laced with that anti-Asiatic tone. And they see that rhetoric as racist, and so they start to see Russians as victims of racism. And one thing that is often brought up is the fact that when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Russians were considered subhuman and basically fit for either sterilization and slave labor or just starvation or death. What that argument often misses, of course, is that the Nazis applied that same idea to other people in the region, most notably Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles. In fact, along with Jews and Roma people, Poles were kind of one of the first victims of the Nazi race war because, of course, the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. And they carried out a number of these war crimes against the Poles in something known as Operation Tannenberg. But the other thing you have to remember about the Nazi propaganda used against Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and whatnot is that, first of all, their whole racial science was nonsense and it was extremely malleable. So if you look at their behavior in, say, 1940, they're like, I don't care if they are Germanic. The Netherlanders can suck it. But then, of course, a few years later, they're like, actually, racial scientists have done some additional research and we found that these people in Belarus and Ukraine and Russia were actually descendants of the Indo-Germanic Aryan race. I believe they were called Scythians or some scheisse. Listen, just take the rifle and get on the truck. We just lost 250,000 troops in Tunisia. And if I don't get any Panzerschokolade, I'm going to volunteer to be a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Right, a round of applause for my improv character, Gunther, the high-strung amphetamine-addicted Nazi officer. But in all seriousness, it is a massive leap to go from people pointing out that life is cheap or not as valued in modern-day Russia than in some other countries to try to act like that is the equivalent to Nazi race theory or that this is Orientalism or something like this. It's really a stretch, and I'll tell you why, because there's a certain group of people, there's actually a lot of them, who will readily tell you that life is not valued that much in Russia. They're called Russians or citizens of Russia. Regardless of whether these people see themselves as anti-Kremlin or opposition, or if they are quite patriotic and love Putin, they will quite happily tell you in so many words that life is not really that valuable there. The difference is really in the sense that opposition-minded Russians see this whole death cult as a bad thing. They see it as a historical problem holding Russia back. Whereas the other side, if they don't see it as something glorious, like this great patriotic sacrifice, they see it as just the way Russia always was and always will be. And if you want to hear more about this from the perspective of someone who was born in the Soviet Union and lived in Russia, I highly recommend this channel called Elvera Berry. That's the name of the host, obviously. Elvira does excellent videos explaining the cultural aspects of Russian society to Westerners in a way that is stripped of the romanticism and the, enigmatic, mysterious Russian soul, that kind of nonsense that you tend to get from usually Westerners who go and live as expats in Russia and come back, or even worse, the ones that still live there. She really breaks it down in detail. She has a lot of good videos, but some of the key ones here on this topic I'm linking down in the description. And like many other people who actually know that country and are from there, you will learn that yes, actually life is cheap there. And again, it has nothing to do with some kind of Asiatic genes or some inherent racial characteristic DNA or anything like that. It is basically the political history of the country, but also, I must say, the West does bear a lot of responsibility in the fact that every time Russia has kind of been forced to face reality, usually in the form of some collapse or revolution, some Western country, often my country, the United States, rushes in there to save their ass. And basically they keep getting insulated from the full consequences of their actions. And then, of course, when the system switches, people are not held accountable. So there's very little incentive for the country to actually change. And that just sort of hammers home that idea that Russia has always been this way, that it is this way, and that it always will be this way. Now, to give you a good idea of the, let's say, mainstream Russian view on the sanctity of life, I could always bring up examples like the so-called human safaris in Kherson Oblast, where Russian drone pilots deliberately hunt and target civilians, often elderly people, using drones. And as I've had to point out many times before, these videos are put out in Russian Telegram channels. They came up with the term human safari. They are proud of it. They don't deny it at all. Likewise, many of the unspeakable atrocities that they have committed towards Ukrainian civilians, and especially Ukrainian prisoners of war, the videos they put out on their own channels. They do not deny this, at least not when they think no dumb, naive Westerners are watching. But let us strip away all possible emotional aspects of this, because for some idiotic reason in the past 15 years or so, the internet decided that anything that could be called emotional is somehow not objective and not rational, not logical. So let's just strip all that away and say, okay, of course the Russians would do that when they're locked in this bitter war that they started, because atrocities against the enemy are common in many wars. Okay, sure. Okay, Mr. Redditor, we will play your little game here. So not only do the Russians brag about what they do to the Ukrainians, they actually brag about what they do to their own people, to their own soldiers. Telegram is full of channels of Russian soldiers being punished by very creative means, I would say near medieval. Videos of these punishments abound. One I saw recently was guys were apparently made to sit at least half naked inside what appeared to be some kind of storage tank, like an empty fuel tank or something, and were basically fed like animals. There are tons of stories of guys being chained to trees without food or water for extended periods of time. There are guys thrown naked into a pit and told to do all sorts of activities together. Beatings are pretty much a given for pretty much anything. Another video came out of a guy who was basically tied behind a Jeep, and they went and did donuts in a field, dragging this guy behind. These are their own soldiers, okay? And why are so many Russian soldiers trying to resist or desert in the first place? Because they are constantly being sent on these completely hopeless assaults, poorly equipped, poorly provisioned, almost zero planning, and basically they're getting picked apart by artillery and drones. Many of them don't even get anywhere near the actual zero line because of that. And I am very proud to have served on a drone crew, keeping those guys from getting Pokrovsk for about 7 months at least. But what do Russia's leaders have to say about all this? Well, just to give you an example, Patriarch Kirill, who is head of an arm of the Russian intelligence services that goes by the name of the Russian Orthodox Church, told followers that sacrifice in the course of carrying out your military duty washes away all sins. This is basically no different from Salafi jihadism or the ideology of the Shia mullahs in Iran. Another thing you might have noticed is that there has been a long trend of Russians appearing on Mavic feeds, and despite having only maybe minor wounds, they go ahead and self-delete. That is not necessarily because they're in extreme pain and know that nobody's coming for them, which is often the case. But actually, this has been encouraged in the Russian military and by some of their state media that it is better to self-delete than be captured. When in fact, captivity for Russian soldiers is actually a lot better than just serving in their army normally. But it really solves a lot of problems for the Russian military if these guys just self-delete somewhere in a field, because then they can be written off as missing, which means that the widow doesn't get any death payment. And who knows, if it happened before the guy actually received his enlistment bonus, then government keeps that money. Or alternatively, his commanders steal it. And that's another thing. As I mentioned many times before, these guys are signing up for massive bonuses and death benefits. Well, guess what? There is actually a type of scam, actually several variants of scams going on in Russia and the occupied territory, where corrupt commanders basically will try to work with certain women to basically, they marry guys just to get the death benefits, and they're in cahoots with the commander who sends them on an assault. There have been a variety of complaints about this. Again, this is stuff that's posted by Russians and it's complained about by Russians. But there really are women basically going around trying to collect, in some cases, multiple death benefits. One was actually asking on social media somewhere if she could collect a second benefit, one because she's remarrying another guy who just happens to be enlisting in the army. Recently, I read the story of a deserter. He was against the war from the start, but found himself mobilized. His officers had threatened him numerous times. Main way they threaten people is just say, we're going to send you to the zero line, and they call it zeroing the person. Basically, they're going to send you on a meat assault, and you get killed, and nobody can prove anything illegal happened because that's a commander. He gave an order. Now, the way this guy escaped, the beginning of it was that he told the commanders have been trying to pressure him to marry some local woman in Donetsk. He understood that the reason they want him to do that is because, like I said, they work together, okay? So they get married, they send him off to the zero line, he gets killed, she gets the benefit, and I suppose they get a cut of some kind. In any case, this is what he suspected was going on. And it's interesting that after everything he had been through with these commanders, they did let him go to Donetsk to do that. So they had a motive to do so. Anyway, I could go on literally for hours just scrolling through these stories that, again, are posted by Russians. You can even find this information posted by pro-Kremlin Russians. There's actually very hardcore idealists and true believers who see it as something holding them back from imperial conquest, because even those fanatics understand that something has gone seriously wrong in this war. That's why it's always better to actually go straight to the source, because one thing I find really funny is the Russians have a lot of fanboys and simps and shills in the West, and the funniest thing about all of them, whether it's Douglas McGregor or Scott the Diddler Ritter, is that they all talk about this war in far more glowing terms than the actual Russians do, especially Russian military experts and military bloggers. I mean, some of these Western simps, like the guys I mentioned before, they've been predicting the total collapse of the Ukrainian military almost every month since 2022. So, as always, don't listen to the Russian shills. Don't listen to the Russians who are putting out material for a foreign audience. Get a good translator or just learn Russian and start reading their own internal discourse. All right, but let's get back to the topic of this video. Why some Westerners, and I really think the person who made this one video and also the person who made the other video, I think their heart's in the right place. I think that They come from a position of anti-racism, which I know this is really controversial to say on the internet today, but that is a good thing. These are good intentions. And I think when they hear some of the stuff said about Russians, especially because some of this stuff gets tinged with this sort of anti-Asian aspect, it kind of sets off the racism alarm bell. But here's the thing, when you're talking about Russians, you're talking about sort of old school 19th century European colonialism, okay? With very few token exceptions, Russia is ruled by very lily white dudes who are not exactly very woke. Okay, it's no secret that Russia often promotes a lot of material in the West designed to stoke racial tension. Talking about the actual, let's say, racism that exists or chauvinism that exists within Russia, that's a subject for an entirely different video. But what I'll say here, and one thing is living in Russia really helped me sort of re-examine what I had previously thought about race in America. One thing is you never want to project American racial identities onto the rest of the world because it just doesn't match up. But you can see some parallels, and the big parallel in Russia is that it's not like an ethno-state where it's like Muscovite Russians are the superior race. It's more like they are the foundation of the nation. The language is superior. The culture is superior. And minorities are tolerated insofar as they are useful, don't cause problems, and don't speak up too much. If they don't get too uppity about wanting to preserve their language or make their native language more practical, because one of the ways Russia sort of suppresses and eliminates local languages is they just make it so it has like no practical use. It has no economic viability because you're not going to go to university and study in Tatar, for example, and you're not going to work at some company where everyone's speaking Tatar, you're going to speak Russian. But generally, that's the way it works. Russians are on top. They have the superior international language, Russian. They have Pushkin. They have Tolstoyevsky. And all those indigenous languages like Tatar, Bashkort, that's just something you use to speak to your grandmother in the village because they're all village languages. And guess what? They used to do the same thing with Ukrainian when that was part of their empire. But like I said, that's a topic for a very long video someday. But what I want to say here is that when you defend the people at the top of that system, I mean, the Muscovite Russians, the white Slavic, and yes, they are by definition Slavic Russians, it just sounds ridiculous because you're talking about the people who basically rule the country and who are, on average, pretty damn racist. And what is more, a lot of times when I hear people say, oh, don't be mean to Russians, and then they bring up like all the cultural things that we shouldn't boycott, I can't help but notice every time they're always bringing up stuff like ballet, Tchaikovsky, Tolstoyevsky. They never say something like, well, what about Sabantuy? What about the beautiful Lezginka dance? What about Buzi? Those are Buryat traditional dumplings, in case you're wondering. The point is, they don't bring these things up because they don't even know about them. All they know about is all the very Western European-like stuff that they associate with Russia. Stuff like ballet, St. Petersburg. Oh, it's so Western European looking. Then just go to Western Europe. It's right there. You don't even need a visa for most of it, okay? But yeah, it's really a type of naivete on the part of many Westerners because we have a luxury in a lot of Western countries, especially in the U.S., or at least we've had this luxury up to now. But when life is good and you live in a free country, you start to think about your personal identity. And what I mean is that your basic needs tend to be met, and so you start to discover more needs. And one thing that's good about a liberal individualist society is that in these societies, especially in the US and UK, for example, Canada, this individuality is really celebrated. People want to seem smart, cool. They want to distinguish themselves from other people. And sometimes this goes to extremes and it leads to stuff like narcissism and knee-jerk contrarianism. But I see those as negative side effects of something that is genuinely, on the whole, good. The idea that you should try to be your own person and express yourself and things like that. In some other countries, it has nothing to do with genes or anything like that. It's more of a cultural thing. In other countries, conformity is seen more as a good thing. And usually those same societies provide their outlets for people to sort of express their own opinions and go against the grain, but at the same time, there can be a lot of social pressure to conform. And when certain people coming from that more individualistic society don't understand that, they sometimes look at someone talking about one of those societies and they think like this is some kind of like racial pseudoscience and they're getting out the calipers or something. It's like, no, actually, in many cases, people from those countries will tell you that. As I was saying earlier, people from Russia across their political spectrum will tell you like, yeah, life is not valued quite as much in Russia. And usually the difference is between those who say that's a bad thing that needs to change. And then you have the people who say, well, it's always going to be that way. And then sometimes you have the fanatics like on state media saying like, it is glorious to die in battle against the Banderite, homosexual, Jewish Nazis. I like to say that's another improv character of mine, but I would probably just be ripping off some actual Russian state media commentator. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that, please, Western people, if you don't have a lot of experience talking to normal Russians and you haven't spent time there and you don't know the language, try not to project the, let's say, racial dynamics of your country onto Russia because it just doesn't fit. And Muscovite Russians, they are not oppressed. Neither are the token minorities that they let into power and that they allow to exercise power in that country. Russia is an imperial empire. It is the last European colonial empire. It should have died long ago, but my country and certain European countries just keep bailing them out and sheltering them from the consequences of their own actions. Hopefully, we will not do that next time. On the flip side, please, please stop blaming Russians' atrocious behavior on Mongols, Mongolians, or other Eastern people, okay? Moscow has to answer for its own behavior. All right, well, that was a long one, but it's something that just kind of been gnawing at me for a while. Over 3 years into this war with all the atrocities that the Russians have committed, you still have these Westerners who just have to remind you that not all Russians are bad. And it's like, we know on a certain level, like I think all of us, when I say us, I mean people like myself, but also many Ukrainians, like we all know at least one Russian who's actually doing the right thing. They're often not in the public eye like the Russian opposition, but they are doing concrete things like supporting the Ukrainian military and telling the truth about Russia, its society, and its regime and what it's doing in Ukraine. But what we often don't like is when you have stuff like Hollywood or social media just constantly trying to thrust Russian stuff into our faces and say, well, it's apolitical. Surely you're not going to boycott everything Russian. And this kind of mentality, even if it is well-meaning, it's something we associate with the unbombed, or we like to call them now UBs or Ubes, unbombed people. And so before commenting when you see some Ukrainians that seem to you to be irrationally upset about what seems like some innocuous Russian cultural thing promoted in the media or whatever, just ask yourself, have I been bombed? Should I be? But seriously, just don't be a Ube. If the thought of talking to actual Ukrainians gives you panic attacks, there are Russians out there that will tell you pretty much everything I just said. And there are also a lot of books written by Russians that give you a good breakdown of what it's like in that society. Once again, I highly recommend the channel by Elvera Berry, because she will tell you a lot of this stuff in lurid detail and also with an extremely calming, soothing voice as well. But before I get sidetracked again, this is basically the end. Enemy at the Gates does suck as a movie. It's a little bit fun now. I'm thinking of watching it on Netflix just for cringe purposes and see how many more historical inaccuracies I can pick out of it. I would be insufferable to watch that movie with. I guarantee you it would be so hard for me to shut up. But as we're wrapping up, as always, I ask you to click like, subscribe, share the videos, especially if this video just happens to be on a topic that you've heard someone you know talk about. And check that description below to find out how you can become a patron and support the channel. I periodically put out sort of behind the scenes podcast for patrons, and also I try to answer patrons' questions in those podcasts. So the last one, I was able to do that. And I hope I'll get more questions after I release the next one. So that's it for today. Take care.